Chapter 24, it's about fluid electrolytes and acid-base balance. So our cells, in order to function properly, they require a specific concentration of ions, including hydrogen, that are diluted within a fluid, which is water. And in order to maintain a careful composition of these three components, we have to have homeostatic mechanisms that helps to maintain an equilibrium of fluids, which we know as fluid balance, also an equilibrium of electrolytes and an equilibrium of the hydrogen ions. All this equilibrium is reached by several systems like urinary system, respiratory system, digestive, integumentary, endocrine, nervous, cardiovascular, and lymphatic systems, and all of them, they work together to help us to maintain these balances. So for fluid balance, so in a newborn, the total body fluid, which is 75% is made out of water. In young men, it's their total amount of water in their body will be between 55 to 60%, and in women, the total amount of water it's around 50%, while in the obese and the elderly, the total amount of water that we have in our body is 45%. So we have an example here about how to calculate this. So if a young man weighs around 70 kilograms or 150 pounds, if you multiply those 70 kilograms by around 55%, you will reach about 40 liters of water. Now, the fluids in our body are located in different compartments, and we have a major subdivision of these compartments, which will be the intracellular fluid, or ICF, and the extracellular fluid, or ECF. So total body water then will be the equivalent of summing up these two compartments, the water in these two compartments, the water in the ECF plus the water in the ICF. Now in here your book talks about being 65% of these fluids found in the intracellular space and 35% found in the extracellular space. And in general, there's a rule that is called the 60-40-20 rule, in which the total body water will be 60%, the ICF, intracellular fluid, will be 40%, and the ECF will be 20% of the body weight. Now, the extracellular fluid is subdivided into different compartments. So we have the tissue or interstitial fluid, that actually is the more properly known as the extracellular fluid, which makes 25% out of that 30%, or sorry, this 35% that your book talks about. Now for the other percentage, so we have 8% within the plasma and the lymph fluid, and then we have 2% of fluid within the transcellular category, which is called also the catch-all. So we have fluids around 2% within the CSF, the synovial fluid, peritoneal, pleural, and pericardial spaces. And then we also have water within the eye. So we have the vitreous and the aqueous humors, and also we have minor amount of water within the bile fluids found within the digestive system, urinary tract, and reproductive tract. Now, fluid is in constant motion, so it's always exchanged between the extracellular space and the intracellular space. And water actually moves through osmosis and uses these little channels that are located within the plasma membrane that are called the aquaporins. Now, water will move easily then through these compartments, and then because water is moving constantly, you can maintain an equilibrium when it comes to maintaining a specific osmolarity or amount of solutes within this extracellular and this intracellular compartment. Now, whenever the osmolarity in the tissues increases, water will tend to move out of the cells so you can dilute this osmolarity and vice versa. So if you have decreased osmolarity, water moves in so you can increase the osmolarity to maintain a proper equilibrium within the extracellular space. And actually, in general, this osmolarity will be between 280 to 300 milliosmoles per liter. Now, osmosis then will be determined by how much solutes you have in each compartment. And the solutes will be all the electrolytes that we have within these compartments. And the major electrolytes that we have in both compartments are sodium within the extracellular fluid and potassium within the intracellular fluid. Now, in general, these solutes, but more of sodium, guys, play a role in how the water distributes within a specific compartment. So since sodium, it's a molecule that attracts water or pulls water, you expect that whenever you have a high concentration of sodium within the plasma, our cells will donate water into that extracellular compartment so you can dilute that amount of sodium that you have in the plasma. So in this picture, we are seeing how the fluid will move through the body. So here you can see that water is absorbed through the digestive tract. From there, the blood vessels that are providing blood supply into this digestive tract will absorb the water, bring it into the circulatory system, and then the circulatory system will distribute this water into the cells, and the cells through these aquaporins will receive the proper amount of water. And then if the cells have excess of water, or if the fluids within the extracellular space have increased osmolarity or increased amount of solutes, the water will flow out of the cells. And then from there, the water will be absorbed again into the circulatory system by the capillaries, and then also by the lymphatic system. So it can return and make a cycle, so we can maintain a proper volume of fluids within the circulatory system. Now, for maintaining an equilibrium of water, a balance of water in our body, we have water gain and losses. So a fluid balance will be when the daily gains and losses are equal, which will be around 2.5 liters per day. Now, we gain water mainly by ingesting water. Whether you are ingesting as part of the food or in the foods that have water contained by itself, like fruits, vegetables, etc., or the water that we drink every day. Now that water is called in general preform, and it's like around 2.3 liters. And we also generate water within our body, and this is called metabolic water. We still haven't gone through this, but in I think in 2 chapters from this, we will start seeing how water is formed. But in the mitochondria, when we are generating ATP, guys, we generate water. So in this chemical reaction that you see here, you are combining a molecule of glucose, the one that it says C6, H12, and O6, and 6 molecules of water, and then you have ATP generated in the mitochondria, but also you generate waste like CO2, 6 molecules of CO2, and also you generate 6 molecules of water, sorry, of oxygen. And these 6 molecules of oxygen are going to combine with hydrogen ions that are transferred in this part of the mitochondria. It's called the inner membrane, and then you form water. Now, the metabolic water that we form in our body is very small amount. Is like 1/5 of a liter or 200 milliliters. So at some point, we don't gain so much water from whatever we produce in our body. So the major gain of water comes from the water that we actually ingest. Now, the loss of water, it can be subdivided into sensible and insensible. So sensible loss of water will be anything that we can see, and basically we produce 1.5 liters of urine. So and then we excrete that urine, so that will be the most amount of water that we lose throughout the day. And then through the process of digestion, we end up losing 200 milliliters of water, which is very small. Basically, it will be the amount of water the amount of water that we lose through defecation. Basically, will be the amount of water that we produce through metabolic water. If you remember, we produce 200 milliliters of metabolic water, and we can lose it through the feces. So basically, over there we can say up to there that we have an equilibrium at some point for those two categories. Now, another sensible loss of water that we have is when we sweat. And in resting adult, we lose like around 100 milliliters of water per day. Now, insensible loss of water will be something that we don't notice. We know that it exists, but we don't notice it. So, for instance, every time that we are exhaling, we are also losing water. So we lose around 200 milliliters of water per day, and then through the skin, in what we call transpiration, we lose 400 milliliters of water per day. And this transpiration is basically when the water goes into the epidermis and then evaporates. This is not the same as sweating. So basically it's evaporation of water. And then of course we can have some variation of these losses according to the environment and the activity of our body. Now we have a third category of water loss, which is called obligatory. And this is basically the amount of water that no matter how much activity you have or whatever physiological condition you have, you will lose it anyway. So this obligatory water loss is around 400 milliliters per day, and it comes from the air or the evaporation of water every time that we exhale, so the expired air or the exhaled air, also through transpiration, in defecation, and also in the minimum urine output, which will be kind of at least 150 milliliters per day. So in this diagram or this figure, you can see the gains and losses and how do you reach an equilibrium. Now, thirst will be the main mechanism that governs our fluid intake. We activate this thirst mechanism when our cells dehydrate, and this is because you have a reduction in the blood volume and in the blood pressure, and you might have an increase in blood osmolarity. Now, osmolarity again means how much solutes do we have in the blood. And the major solutes that osmolarity accounts for will be sodium, bicarbonate ions, chloride, and actually glucose. And all of these will be, of course, diluted in the plasma, in the extracellular fluid, which basically is part of plasma is part of it. And we have within the hypothalamus, this center in the brain, we have osmoreceptors that can detect how many solutes do you have in the blood or in the plasma. Whenever you have changes in this osmolarity, you will activate this thirst mechanism, or you do not activate this mechanism. Now, the osmoreceptors that we have in the hypothalamus respond also to angiotensin II. And if you remember, this angiotensin II is converted from this precursor of angiotensin I in the lungs. So how can someone then activate this thirst mechanism? So if someone has hypotension for whatever reason, possibly the person has a hemorrhage. So these osmoreceptors indirectly will detect this change because you have these baroreceptors within the carotid bodies that will send a signal into the osmoreceptors, and then also you will have this mechanism activated, the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system that we talked about last time, and you will have the release of angiotensin II that will activate these osmoreceptors together with an increase in the osmolarity that you have in the ECF, in the extracellular fluid. Then your osmoreceptors will send a signal to the cerebral cortex, and then you will activate the thirst mechanism, so you will feel thirsty and then you will go and drink water. And hopefully you will increase the blood pressure if you have hypotension. Now, the hypothalamus also helps to maintain balance of fluids by producing this hormone that is called ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. Whenever you have loss of fluids, your hypothalamus will release this ADH, and this ADH will help to prevent water loss. So your kidneys will not excrete water. Now, we have to have between 2 to 3% increase in osmolarity, or 10 to 15% of loss of blood volume, to have an intense sense of thirst. Now, salivation is inhibited when you have thirst, and then your sympathetic signals from the thirst center will send a signal into the salivary glands so that your salivary glands won't produce more saliva. So you will preserve this fluid that is, or this water that is in the saliva, so it can go into the circulatory system rather. So now for the long-term inhibition of thirst, which is a mechanism to maintain fluid balance. So you will absorb water from the small intestine, and this water will go into the circulatory system, diluting the overconcentrated solutes in your blood. So basically you will reduce your osmolarity in the blood. And then that will prevent your osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus from sending signals into the cerebral cortex, and also it helps to promote the capillary filtration, and then you will start making the saliva more abundant and watery. So after you drink water, it will require 30 minutes or longer time to take effect. Now we have also a mechanism that is called a short-term inhibition of thirst, which is basically while someone is cooling and moistening their mouth, that helps to quench the thirst. Now at some point this it's not very effective, but at some point it helps in the short term. So the short-term response basically it helps us to prevent us from over drinking water. Now for regulation of the output of water. So we control how much water we lose by making changes in the volume of urine that our kidneys produce. Now the kidneys itself cannot replace water or electrolytes. They only can slow the rate of water and electrolyte loss until you drink water or ingest electrolytes. Now the kidneys regulate how much water we lose or how much urine you produce by changing the reabsorption of sodium. So whenever you require water in your body, you will reabsorb more sodium, so the water will follow the sodium that you have reabsorbed, and then you prevent the excretion of sodium, so you prevent the loss of water. Now one mechanism that helps to prevent water loss in the kidneys is by the secretion of ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. So again, whenever you have high concentration of solutes in your blood, your osmoreceptors will be activated, and then in order to decrease this osmolarity, to bring it back to normal, you will secrete ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and this hormone will reach the proximal and distal convoluted tubules and the collecting ducts within your kidneys, and then you start synthesizing aquaporins so you can absorb more water. Mainly this water absorption is going to happen within the collecting ducts. So you can have water back into the medulla, and then you can have this absorption of water into the circulatory system, and then you can decrease your osmolarity. So this is basically the loop that happens for maintaining this equilibrium of fluids between the brain, and the kidneys. Now, some problems that it can happen in fluid balance is fluid deficiency, in which your excess of loss is more than whatever you ingest, and this can happen for a longer period of time or a short period of time, but depending on how much fluid deficiency you have is going to be the consequence. One of the most serious consequences of having especially an acute or sudden loss of fluid will be circulatory shock. And our body will have these compensatory mechanisms, like, for instance, uh, it will increase the the heart rate, and it also create vasoconstriction, so you can maintain the blood pressure, which is important to send blood into the brain, so you will not have a neuronal problem. Now, two types of deficiency that we can have are volume depletion and dehydration. Volume depletion is also known as hypovolemia, and this can happen when you have basically same amount of water and sodium lost without replacement. And in this case, of course, you have a decrease in the TBW, but your osmolarity remains normal. Examples of when you can have hypovolemia is when you have a hemorrhage, when you have severe burns, chronic vomiting, diarrhea, or a disease that is called Addison's disease, in which you have problems with the adrenal cortex that prevents you from retaining fluids. Now, the other deficiency of water in our body or fluids in our body is called dehydration, and this is also known as negative fluid balance. In this case, your body is eliminating more water than sodium. So in this case, you have an increased osmolarity in the ECF, and dehydration can happen because of several causes, like if you don't drink enough water, if you have diabetes, you are losing water, if you are not properly secreting ADH because you might have a stroke within the hypothalamus or something that prevents them from secreting this ADH. And in this case, whenever you have low levels of ADH secreted by your pituitary, uh, by your hypothalamus, this is called diabetes insipidus. Another cause of dehydration is when someone is sweating profusely, or when someone is overusing diuretics. Now, in general, infants are more susceptible to dehydration than adults because kids or infants, they have a higher metabolic rate than adults, and their immature kidneys, they are not properly concentrating the urine to prevent this problem to be compensated. Now, whenever somebody has dehydration, all the fluid compartments will be affected. Now, when in the case of when someone is dehydrated because of excess sweating, the sweat that it is produced by capillary filtration, and then the person will have a decrease in the blood volume and the blood pressure, and then the osmolarity will rise. And this water will be very important if someone is losing a huge amount of water. Now, the water that someone loses when sweating, of course, is distributed into the environment by evaporation at some point. And if you can see here at the bottom of this slide, here you have this filtration of water that goes into the sweat glands, and then from there it goes into the environment. Now, for the fluid balance in cold weather. So whenever we are in a cold weather environment, our blood vessels will constrict. And then this will help to increase the blood pressure, and then you will have inhibition of the secretion of ADH, and you will start secreting a hormone that is called natriuretic peptide, and then your water that you lose through the urine will be increased, and then your blood volume will be reduced. Now, in cold weather, both respiratory and urinary losses cause a state of reduced blood volume or hypovolemia, something that you might not think about, but it happens. And no matter that you think that you're not losing water, you're still losing water, and then you have to start having your intake of water in order to prevent hypovolemic shock. Now, we can have the opposite as well, in which you can have excess of fluid. And in general, excess of fluid is less common than fluid deficiency, because no matter that you drink a lot of water, your kidneys will work extra and it will excrete extra water. So you basically will go more to pee. Now, just in case, no matter if you drink normal amount of water or more amount of water than what you need, if your kidneys are not properly functioning, like in renal failure, you will have retention of fluids. So you will have fluid excess. Now, it will take a huge amount of fluid loss, guys, for being in danger of running into problems like having hypovolemia or death. If you can see here in this graph, we have on the y-axis the blood volume in liters, and in the x-axis we have the fluid intake of liters per day. So you have to have in the green area an intake of water of 1.5 to 3 liters per day. Now, if you increase that fluid intake greater than 3 liters, you have water diuresis, so basically you will go and pee more. Now, dangerous situation is when someone is not ingesting enough water, like is not drinking over 1.5 liters of water. And remember, we're talking about adults that don't have any kidney dysfunction. So when these persons have hypovolemia for whatever cause, possibly the person has a hemorrhage because he went into an accident, and if the person blood volume drops from 5 liters into 4, the person will start having this mechanism that will try to compensate by this hypovolemia. However, if the loss of blood goes greater than 2 liters, or well, a little bit less than 2 liters, the person can die. but at some point we already know that we have to stop the hemorrhage for preventing this from happening. And then from there you can introduce IV fluids. Now, we have two types of fluid excesses. We have volume excess, in which both sodium and water are retained. So in this case, we will have what we call isotonic water retention, in which the osmolarity of the ECF is intact, so you don't have hyperosmolarity or hypoosmolarity. And this type of volume excess can happen because someone has hypersecretion of aldosterone, which will lead to more absorption of sodium and water, or if someone has renal failure. Now, another type of fluid excess is when someone has what we call hypotonic hydration, in which the person is over ingesting water possibly, and the person will have what is called water intoxication or positive fluid balance. Now, at some point, this is a very rare event, but it can happen. And in this case, the excess of water will cause the osmolarity on the extracellular fluid to drop. So in this case, we will have what we call hypotonic hydration. And in order for us to return back into normal osmolarity, you will have a shift of water from the extracellular fluid into the intracellular space. So the cells will start to swell. So when this happens, then we can have severe effects like pulmonary and cerebral edema and death. Another case of imbalance of fluid is when you have what we call fluid sequestration, in which instead of having the fluid in a specific compartment, it will go into a compartment where there is normally not located in a specific amount. Okay, one example will be a hemorrhage in which the blood that pulls into the tissues is lost from the circulatory system, pleural effusion, in which the fluid goes into the pleural cavity, and another case will be when someone has something that we call ascites, in which fluid goes into the peritoneal cavity in excess. Okay, of course, we already know that a certain amount of fluid is supposed to be in the peritoneal cavity, in the pleural cavity, but not in excess. That's what we are talking about when it comes to sequestration. So basically, it will be excess of fluid in spaces where they shouldn't have that many fluid. Okay, so that's all about fluid balance. Now let's move into electrolyte balance. So electrolytes are electrically charged molecules. So we have these electrolytes that are coming from our diet, like table salt is sodium chloride. We have potassium coming from bananas, tomatoes. So we ingest all these electrolytes. And these electrolytes, when they come into our body, some of them, they are present as salts, and then they get in contact with water, they get dissolved, they get separated into their different components. Like for instance, for sodium chloride, salt, when you ingest it or when you dilute it into water, you separate the sodium from the chloride, and each of them gain a particular electrical charge. In the case of sodium will be positive, in the case of chloride will be negative. And they will have, as I told you before, electrolytes, a particular electrical charge. And depending on that particular electrical charge, you will call them cations for positively charged ions and anions for negatively charged ions. And these anions and cations will be distributed within the different compartments that we talk about uh, for fluid balance. And they will be present in different concentrations, and they will participate in an exchange of electrolytes between these two compartments that in some cells, like excitable cells like the neurons and the muscle cells, will help them to function because of this exchange of ions. So basically, they will determine the electrical potential or charge difference between the cell membranes. And this will have an effect on the osmolarity of body fluids, especially sodium, bicarbonate ions, and chloride. So here in the bottom you can see then major cations, which are sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and hydrogen ions. And then we have major ions or negatively charged ions like chloride, bicarbonate, and phosphate. Now, maintaining an electrolyte balance in between compartments doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have equal amounts of these electrolytes within these compartments. So you don't necessarily need to have the same amount of sodium inside the cells or in the intracellular fluid and outside of the cells or the extracellular fluid to have a balance. Now we have different electrolytes that are located within these compartments that all will contribute to the positive charges or negative charges that ultimately will bring an equilibrium into these different fluids, and then the cells can work properly. So in this diagram you can see the electrolyte concentrations within the different compartments. So in the top you have basically the concentration of electrolytes within the ECF or the plasma. So basically these electrolytes are measured, guys, in what we call milliequivalents per liter, or and well, in general, the osmolarity of these electrolytes, as they're making this osmolarity, will be measured in milliosmoles per liter. So these are units that are used in the lab to measure these amounts of electrolytes. So for the extracellular fluid, the most concentrated cation and in general ions will be sodium. So we have around 145 milliequivalents per liter of sodium. The next one will be chloride with 103, and then we have calcium, potassium, magnesium, and inorganic phosphate. All of them, they make around 300 milliosmoles per liter. Now, for the intracellular fluid, potassium is the most concentrated ion with around 150 milliequivalents per liter. Sodium will be 12, chloride will be 4. Then we have inorganic phosphate and phosphates in general, which will be 75, magnesium 40, and calcium less than 1. And if you look at the osmolarity of both compartments, it's the same, 300 milliosmoles per liter. So functions of sodium, basically it helps to maintain what we call the resting membrane potential, which, depending if it's a nerve cell or a muscle cell, it can range between minus 90 to minus 70 millivolts. That's the unit for measuring the resting membrane potential, if you recall from your AMP1. So that's minus 70 millivolts per liter. That's millivolts, sorry, per, it's not per liter, it's minus 70 millivolts. It's a unit of electricity. And then whenever sodium, which is located outside of the cells, rushes into the cells through these sodium channels, the cells will become less negative. So it will depolarize. So creating then, after this depolarization, the reaching of the threshold, which is usually minus 60 millivolts, and then complete depolarization, reaching plus 20 or so millivolts, and then you will create an action potential with the second portion of the action potential, which will be repolarization. So sodium itself is very important for the osmolarity of the ECF, that it accounts for 90 to 95% of the osmolarity. So sodium is maintained in that amount of about 145 milliequivalents per liter outside the cells, just because of this sodium potassium pump that exchanges these potassium and sodium ions. So you can maintain this ratio of high potassium within the inside of the cells and high amounts of sodium outside of the cells. And when you're doing this, you are activating the metabolism of cells, which also is responsible for generating body heat. Now, within the extracellular fluid, we also have bicarbonate ions that are combined with sodium. And bicarbonate ions itself forms something that we call a buffer that helps to maintain a specific amount of hydrogen ions in the appropriate range, which is between 7.35 to 7.45. Now this is a scale, guys. This is a logarithmic scale that represents a very small amount of hydrogen ions that we have within the extracellular fluid. Now sodium, it is exchanged then for potassium with this sodium potassium pump, but also sodium can enter into the cell together with ions, with molecules like glucose, with the sodium glucose cotransporter. Also it can be exchanged for potassium and calcium. We have to have in our diet around half gram of sodium per day, but we consume more than that, between 3 to 7 grams. Now, if you have excess of sodium in your cells, in your body, in your extracellular fluid, you will become dehydrated because you're increasing the osmolarity. And then your cells will donate water, so the intracellular fluids will move from the cells into the extracellular space, and then you will activate this thirst mechanism. What it means is that in this case you will increase volume, and then you can have hypertension. Now, in general, if you have properly functioning kidneys, besides that you activate the thirst mechanism and then you drink more water to decrease the osmolarity, your kidneys, guys, will get rid of the excess of sodium. And in any electrolyte that you ingest in excess, your kidneys will excrete them to maintain the proper osmolarity. So the kidneys play a huge role in the equilibrium or the balance of electrolytes, no matter which electrolyte you are talking about. Uh, Again, this is repetitive. Aldosterone, it is a hormone that helps also as well to maintain equilibrium of these electrolytes. Aldosterone is produced by the adrenal cortex, and when you have this aldosterone in your bloodstream, you have aldosterone reaching through the bloodstream the ascending limb of the loop of Henle and also the DCT and the cortical part of the collecting duct. And then this aldosterone will create this binding, this aldosterone will bind to these nuclear receptors within these cells that will activate the transcription of a gene that it is important to make more sodium and potassium pumps. So after you have aldosterone within your kidneys between 10 to 30 minutes, you will make more sodium and potassium pumps in these cells, put them in the plasma membrane, and then your renal tubules will reabsorb more sodium and they will secrete hydrogen and potassium. And then your absorption of sodium will help to increase water absorption and also chloride absorption. So what will be the primary effect of having aldosterone around the kidneys will be that your kidneys will have less sodium chloride, but they will have, the urine will have less sodium chloride and it will have more potassium and it will have a lower pH, or will be more acid, what we call more acid. So this is a diagram to show you the action of aldosterone that we already talked about. So basically your sodium will be reabsorbed, which will lead to less sodium present in your urine, and at some point that will help to increase the absorption of water, and then you will increase your blood volume. Now, when you have increased blood pressure, you will inhibit this renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, and then your kidneys will not reabsorb more sodium. Now, another player in the regulation of sodium will be antidiuretic hormone that will modify the excretion of water independently of sodium excretion. Now, when someone has increased sodium in their blood, this will, as I told you before, activate the osmoreceptors, and then your hypothalamus will release ADH. And then your kidneys will start reabsorbing water, and this will increase the concentration of sodium. But if your sodium levels will drop for any cause, ADH release will be inhibited. So more water will be excreted and the sodium concentration will increase. Now, another hormone that helps to regulate concentration of sodium is natriuretic peptide. This name itself implies something. It's a peptide, so it's a hormone made out of short segment of amino acids, and actually this one, it is produced by the right atrium. So this hormone specifically will inhibit sodium reabsorption when you have increased return of blood volume into the right atrium. So if you have hypervolemia, the opposite of hypovolemia, your right atrium will sense it. The walls of the right atrium will become more distended. The cells within the right atrium will generate these natriuretic peptides, and natriuretic peptide means, guys, natrium, which is the Latin name for sodium, and uresis, uretic. So you will be urinating more sodium. So this will help to decrease sodium in your bloodstream, and you will prevent water reabsorption. So your kidneys will eliminate more sodium and water, decreasing blood volume and decreasing blood pressure. Now, estrogen, it's a hormone that mimics the action of aldosterone. So you, with increased levels of estrogen, you retain sodium in water. Progesterone is the opposite, will reduce the sodium reabsorption, and you will have a diuretic effect. And this is also sort of the opposite for glucocorticoids, which promote sodium reabsorption, uh, promote water absorption and edema or retention of fluids. And sodium homeostasis it's also achieved by regulating salt intake. So whenever we have hyponatremia, which by the way is the name of low sodium, we will have salt cravings. So these are the two names then for imbalance of sodium. So we can have hypernatremia, in which you have increased sodium concentration, which will be greater, having sodium levels greater than 145 milliequivalents per liter, which usually happens because of administration of an IV saline solution that will be in general what we call hypertonic at some point, or and the other imbalance will be when you have low levels of sodium, which will be hyponatremia. In this case, your plasma sodium concentration will be less than 130 milliequivalents, and it can be the result of having excess of body water, quickly corrected by excretion of excess of water, and also it can be because someone loses large volumes of sweat or urine and is replacing it with drinking plain water without any electrolytes. For potassium, so potassium, similarly as sodium, will be responsible for maintaining a resting membrane potential and also for generating action potential within excitable cells like the nerve and muscle cells. Again, this is the most abundant cation in the intracellular fluid, and this will be determining the intracellular osmolarity rather than the extracellular osmolarity, as it happens with the with sodium in the extracellular space. Now, potassium is necessary for the formation of some proteins, so it is a cofactor in some enzymes that produces some some ribosomes that produces proteins, and other metabolic processes. So similarly as for sodium, potassium homeostasis is regulated by the kidneys and by ingestion of this potassium to our diet. So 90% of the potassium that it is found in the glomerular filtrate is reabsorbed by the proximal convoluted tubule, and 10% will be excreted by the urine. Now, just in case that we need to maintain more potassium within our blood, our DCT and the collecting ducts will reabsorb or secrete different amounts of potassium. Now, aldosterone increases the secretion of potassium, so it can cause something that we call hypokalemia. Now, in terms of electrolyte imbalances, potassium is most dangerous than others. Hyperkalemia will be excess of potassium, and the effects for this hyperkalemia will depend if the concentration of potassium is increased quickly or slowly. Now, if the concentration of potassium rises really quick, which we call also crash injury, you'll have this extracellular potassium in excess that will make your nerve cells and your muscle cells abnormally excitable, and it will produce cardiac arrhythmias and arrest. Now, whenever you have slow onset of this hyperkalemia, you will inactivate your voltage gated sodium channels in your nerve and your muscle cells will become less excitable. Now, hypokalemia is having potassium less than 3.5 milliequivalents per liter. This rarely happens, but it can happen, and if it happens, it's because someone is not ingesting enough potassium. Now, other causes will be when someone is sweating, it has chronic vomiting, diarrhea, when someone is using excess of laxatives, or if someone has increased secretion of aldosterone because he has possibly a tumor within the adrenal gland that secretes aldosterone, or when someone has an imbalance of pH that we call alkalosis. In this case, low levels of potassium will make your nerve cells and your muscle cells to be less excitable, which will lead to weakness of muscle cells, loss of tone within the muscles, decreased reflexes, arrhythmias as well, and then possibly cardiac arrest. So this figure is to show you the imbalance in potassium. So in the top part here, you can see what happens with hyperkalemia. In this case, you can see that your cells become more excitable. So in this diagram of the starting of an electric action potential, you can see the elevation of these millivolts to the plus sign. So the cells can become more easily depolarized, or are potentially or partially, depolarized. And then the opposite will be when you have hypokalemia. So you have a drop in the millivolts more than the resting member potential. So your cells will be something that we call reduced RPM or hyperpolarized. So your cells become less excitable. Now for chloride, this will be the most abundant anion in the extracellular fluid, and it also plays a role in the maintenance of the specific osmolarity of the extracellular fluid together with sodium. Now, chloride is necessary for the formation of hydrochloric acid in the stomach, and also helps to maintain this exchange of CO2 in the red blood cells by something that we call the chloride shift. And because of this chloride shift and this exchange of CO2 within the red blood cells, chloride also plays a major role in regulating the pH of the body. Now, homeostasis of chloride, it is achieved together with the homeostasis of sodium. And at some point, this is because chloride, since it's an anion, it attracts positively charged ions like sodium, and also it can attract other positively charged ions like potassium and calcium. So basically, these cations are attracted by this anion. Nothing out of the ordinary. I mean, a cation is positively charged and an anion is negatively charged, so it's more than likely that something positive get attracted by something negative, if you think about it, even in real life. But anyway, so then, as you expect, when sodium is retained, then chloride ions are also retained. And chloride imbalances will affect the acid-base balance and vice versa. So then what are the changes, or what are the names of imbalances for chloride? Hyperchloremia, when you have excess of chloride, and it can happen because someone is ingesting a lot of sodium in their diet. Those delicious French fries, hot dogs, pizza, they have a lot of sodium chloride, guys. So you expect to have also not only increase in sodium, but also in chloride. Or when someone has administration of IV saline that is hypertonic, you expect an increase in chloride too. Hypochloremia would be the opposite, is the side effect of hyponatremia, and also it can be a result of hyperkalemia or acidosis. Now for calcium. So calcium has different functions in our body, like forming part of the bone and the teeth in our body. So calcium combines with other ions to form calcium carbonate salts, etc., that maintains the bones healthy. And also it's important for the contraction of actin and of muscles, for the sliding of actin over myosin. And it also helps to act as a second messenger for some hormones and neurotransmitters in our body, and also helps in the release of neurotransmitters in the synapses, and it is a clothing factor as well. Now, calcium is more elevated in the extracellular space than in the intracellular space. In the intracellular space, we don't require so much calcium unless the cells are excitable, like the muscle cells. So calcium then is stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum within muscle cells, and it prevents them from being within the cytoplasm when it's not necessary. Okay. Now, the homeostasis of calcium ions is maintained mainly by parathormone, or the hormone released by the parathyroid uh, gland, by vitamin D or calcitriol, and by calcitonin. This will uh, regulate the absorption and excretion of sodium. Now, sorry, calcium. Calcium is absorbed by the intestinal cells and is excreted by the kidneys. Now, imbalances of calcium, hypercalcemia, having calcium greater than 5.8 milliequivalents per liter. It can be because someone is in an imbalance of the pH that we call alkalosis, because someone has hyperparathyroidism in which the person releases excess of PTH or parathyroid, and this hormone actually activates the osteoclasts within the bones so they can start reabsorbing these salts of calcium that we have in the bone to release calcium into our bloodstream. Or if someone has hypothyroidism, thyroid gland secretes calcitonin, okay, which helps to maintain low levels of calcium. And when someone has hypothyroidism, more than likely it will not produce enough calcitonin. And then if you don't produce enough calcitonin, you won't be able to absorb this calcium, deposit into the bones, so that the calcium will be maintained elevated within the bloodstream. Now, when someone has hypercalcemia, it will have a reduction in the permeability of sodium. So the cells will depolarize less, and also, the nerve cells and muscle cells will depolarize less, so you will have less excitable cells. Now, whenever you have hypercalcemia greater than 12 milliequivalents per liter, you have severe muscular weakness, depressed reflexes, and cardiac arrhythmias. Hypocalcemia is the opposite of hypercalcemia, so you have calcium at lower levels than 4.5 milliequivalents per liter, and some of the causes will be deficiency of vitamin D intake, diarrhea, pregnancy, acidosis, lactation, hypoparathyroidism, and hyperthyroidism. So in this case, for hypoparathyroidism, you will have low levels of PTH available. So if your diet is not sufficient to maintain the normal levels of calcium, then your parathyroid gland won't secrete PTH, and then you won't be able to absorb calcium, and also to chew up calcium from your bones so you can increase calcium. So you don't have this compensatory mechanism. And then in hyperthyroidism, if you secrete excess of calcitonin due to having hyperthyroidism, you have so much calcitonin that you will start absorbing more calcium, and then you will have these these low levels of calcium in your bloodstream. Now, in this case, when you have hypocalcemia, you will increase the permeability of the cells to sodium, and this will make your cells more excitable. And when you have this hypocalcemia at very low levels, you can have these spasms within the muscle cells that are more prolonged than the sliding of actin and filament during normal contractions, and this sustained contraction, you call it tetany. You can have also spasm within the muscles of the larynx, and then you can have this obstruction of the airway that will lead to poor ventilation to the lungs and death. Okay, for magnesium. Magnesium, it is combined with ions in the bone. Around 54% of magnesium is found in the bone and 45% in the intracellular fluid. Now, in the intracellular fluid, magnesium will be combined with ATP, and it will help also to form a complex with enzymes, so it's a cofactor for enzymes, for transporter and nucleic acids. Now, we need to have between 1.5 and 2 milliequivalents per liter of magnesium in our blood, and these levels are maintained by intestinal absorption of magnesium from the food if you have a good diet that is rich in magnesium, and this absorption will be regulated together with calcium by vitamin D. Magnesium excess is lost in feces and urine, and specifically in the ascending loop of the nephron loop, or the loop of Henle, will reabsorb magnesium and determines the extent of retention or loss of magnesium. Similarly, as for calcium, PTH will play a role in the reabsorption or in the maintenance of magnesium in the bloodstream. Hypomagnesemia will be low levels of magnesium. It can be caused by loss of magnesium in fluids in your body, like when someone is vomiting, when someone has diarrhea, when someone has renal problems, or intestinal malabsorption. What is going to be the clinical effects? Well, the person will have hyperirritability of their nervous and muscular systems. You have tremors or shaking in their phalanges in the hands. It will have spasms, tetanus, hypertension, tachycardia, and heart arrhythmia. Hypermagnesemia will be the opposite, is when someone has increased levels of magnesium in their blood, and this will happen very rarely unless someone has renal insufficiency and won't be able to excrete magnesium. Now, the clinical effects of hypermagnesemia is that someone is going to be lethargic. It will have weakness in their muscles, weak reflexes, respiratory depression, hypotension, and will have cardiac arrest. Now we will skip about phosphates because these imbalances rarely happens. Only I can tell you that phosphates are important components of nucleic acids, phospholipids, ATP, ATP, cyclic AMP, and creatine in phosphate. And these phosphates basically play a role in maintaining the hydrogen balance within the body fluids, and also helps to maintain a negative charge within the cells. Now for acid-base balance, so this is one of the most important aspects of homeostasis, because many components of the cells, like the enzymes, are sensitive to changes in the pH. Enzymes, if you recall, are proteins, and proteins have a three-dimensional shape. And when you have this, especially this imbalance of pH, which we call acidosis or excess of hydrogen ions, this three-dimensional shape of the enzymes is gone. And if they don't have then these enzymes, this three-dimensional shape or this normal shape, the enzymes won't function. So enzymes are molecules or proteins that activates our metabolism. And if our metabolism is not working, we can have serious consequences in our body. Okay, so the pH in a solution, or the concentration of hydrogen ions, is determined by the concentration of the hydrogen ions. It sounds redundant, but that's basically how it is. Measurement of pH is basically measuring what is the concentration of hydrogen ions. Now, to understand this balance of hydrogen ions, or the concentration of hydrogen ions in our body, we have to understand some terms like acids. Acids are chemicals that can release hydrogen ions in a solution. And bases will be the opposite. So will be chemicals that can absorb hydrogen ions in a solution. Now, acids can be classified as strong or weak. And a strong acid will be a donor of hydrogens that give up most of its hydrogen ions in a higher rate. This will lead to lowering the pH of a solution. So when a solution has a low pH, that means that it has a high concentration of hydrogen ions. An example of a strong acid is hydrochloric acid. Now, a weak acid will be a substance or a chemical that releases its hydrogen ions slowly. It will change the pH of a solution, so it will increase the concentration of hydrogen ions, or it will lower the pH, but not as to a greater extent as a strong acid does. But still, it will change the concentration of hydrogen ions because it will be donating hydrogen ions. An example of a weak acid would be carbonic acid, or H2CO3. A base will be an acceptor of hydrogen ions, the opposite of an acid, which is a donor of hydrogen ions. Similarly, as for acids, we have classification for bases. So we have strong bases and weak bases. A strong base will be one that accepts these hydrogen ions avidly, and it will change the pH by raising the pH or lowering the concentration of hydrogen ions. And it does so rapidly. An example of a strong base will be hydroxide ions. A weak base, it will accept hydrogen ions but less avidly than a strong base. And also it will have an effect on pH, so it will increase the pH or lower the concentration of hydrogen ions because it is accepting these hydrogen ions, but it will do so at a lower rate than a strong base. An example of a weak base is bicarbonate ions, or HCO3 minus. So our normal range of pH is between 7.35 and 7.45. As I told you before, this is a logarithmic scale. It doesn't mean that we have between 7.35 and 7.45 single hydrogen ions. Okay, so this scale represents a very small amount of hydrogen ions in our body that is hard to write down, so that's why without making a mistake when you're writing down this concentration, so that's why we use this scale. Now we can have challenges then to maintaining this concentration of hydrogen ions in our body, so we can have challenges to the acid-base balance. When we are using glucose in our body, guys, one of the byproducts of glucose is producing acids. One of the major acids will be lactic acid, and then that will tend to drop the pH or increase the concentration of hydrogen ions. Another part of the metabolism of our body that it can generate acids or challenge the acid-base balance is the creation of phosphoric acids from the metabolism of nucleic acids, which hardly will happen, but it can happen. Well, it happens. No, hardly will happen. It happens, but very rarely. Okay, so another challenge to the acid-base balance is through the production of fatty acids or ketone bodies from whenever someone is metabolizing their fats, and also through this exchange of CO2 in the red blood cells, we generate something that we call carbonic acid. Now, a buffer is any substance that it has an acid and a base that together that can accept or donate hydrogen ions in order to maintain a proper pH balance. So it will be a substance that resists changes in the pH. Now, in our body, we have different buffer systems that help us to maintain this acid-base balance. Some examples would be urinary system buffers, respiratory system buffers, and the plasma buffer system. Now, the respiratory system buffer works within minutes after someone has a change in the pH, while the urinary system will have this buffering effect that takes several hours to days to maintain an acid-base balance. Now, a chemical buffer then, as I said before, will be a substance that can bind hydrogen ions and remove it from the solution as the hydrogen ions start increasing within the solution, or it will release hydrogen ions into the solution if the concentration of hydrogen ions starts decreasing. This will help to restore the pH balance in fractions of a second, and buffer systems will be a mixture of weak acids and weak bases in our body. In our body, we don't have strong acids or strong bases. We only have weak acids and weak bases that are necessary to deal with all these changes in hydrogen ion concentrations. So we don't need strong acids or strong bases. So the major classification of then buffer systems in our body will be something that we call bicarbonate, phosphate, and protein systems. Proteins have amino groups, guys, or carboxyl groups that can act as acids or bases, or donors of hydrogen ions and acceptors of hydrogen ions to maintain the pH balance. The most active buffer system that we have in our body is the carbonic acid bicarbonate system. I already drew this reaction to you in lecture. So it's when you combine CO2 and water, you form carbonic acid, H2CO3, and then this carbonic acid can be broken down into bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. This reaction, if you recall, or this production of acid and bases will be given by carbonic anhydrase enzyme, or CAH. and it's a reversible reaction. It can go in both directions. So you can lower your pH, as you can see here, by combining CO2 water, forming carbonic acid, and then forming bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. Or you can increase your pH by combining hydrogen ions with bicarbonate ions, making carbonic acid, and then breaking down this carbonic acid into water and CO2. Now this system will work together with the lungs and the kidneys to maintain pH and CO2. Now, in general, whenever you have increased levels of CO2 in your body because you are hyperventilating, for instance, you will increase concentration of hydrogen ions. So basically you will decrease the pH, something that we call acidosis. Compensatory mechanism for acidosis will be hyperventilation and excretion of hydrogen ions by the kidneys. Now, along with that, your kidneys have the ability to produce bicarbonate ions, which helps to absorb these hydrogen ions that are in excess. So it's a buffer, bicarbonate. Specifically, the parts of the kidneys that will help to regulate this pH will be the renal tubules. The protein buffer system is basically the last system that we use to regulate our pH, and the protein buffer system accounts for about 3/4 of all chemical buffering in the body fluids. As I said before, as I mentioned in two slides ago, in the two previous slides, guys, within proteins we have these carboxyl groups and these amino groups that helps to absorb or release hydrogen ions when necessary. Now, we have then this respiratory control of the pH. So whenever we have this acidosis, we can hyperventilate, so we can release CO2 in the environment to lower the concentration of hydrogen ions indirectly, or vice versa. When someone has alkalosis, okay, when someone is exhaling excess of CO2, you will hypoventilate, so you will retain CO2, and then you can lower the pH. Now, CO2 is constantly generated in our body because our cells are generating this CO2 as a byproduct of aerobic metabolism, and then we combine this CO2 that our cells generate with water, forming again carbonic acid, and then this carbonic acid will be dissociated into bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. So our metabolism basically tends to lower the pH by releasing hydrogen ions at some point. And then when we bring this carbonic acid into our lungs, we have this CAH enzyme, this carbonic anhydrase enzyme, that it can break down this carbonic acid, guys, into CO2 and water, and the CO2 will be exhaled and the water will be exhaled too. If you put your hand in front of your oral cavity, in front of your mouth, and you exhale, you will feel the vapor in your hands. This is because we are exhaling H2O. So, increased CO2 and decreased pH will stimulate pulmonary ventilation, while an increased pH inhibit pulmonary ventilation. So, whenever you have acidosis, you have increased CO2, you will hyperventilate. And when you have alkalosis, the opposite of acidosis, you will hypoventilate as a compensatory mechanism. And when you have acidosis, your kidneys will excrete more hydrogen ions, and when you have alkalosis, since you need hydrogen ions, you have low concentration of hydrogen ions, your kidneys will preserve hydrogen ions, so you will absorb hydrogen ions to increase hydrogen ions so you can go back into normal pH. And the kidneys can neutralize more acid or base than either the respiratory system or the chemical buffer. So they play an important role in the long run to maintaining normal pH. Specifically, again, the renal tubules will play an important role in maintaining pH by secreting hydrogen ions into the tubular fluids. And this is how the hydrogen ions will come into this into this cycle of maintaining the pH. So here we have the cells of the renal tubules. Okay, this will be the basal side of the cells. This is the apical side. This is the tubular fluid. This is the capillaries at the peritubular. Well, these are the peritubular capillaries, basically, at the basal side of these cells. So whenever you have these hydrogen ions in here, in your peritubular capillaries, they can combine with CO2 that was broken down in here from these bicarbonate ions, and then you can form this carbonic acid that is going to be broken down again into hydrogen ions and CO2. CO2 is going to diffuse into these cells of the proximal convoluted tubule, and then these are going to be combined with water to form this carbonic acid again, and then in these cells in here you will absorb hydrogen ions. You will break down this this carbonic acid into bicarbonate ions and to hydrogen ions. Hydrogen ions are going to be excreted, while bicarbonate is going to be brought back again into the peritubular capillaries to restart the cycle. And then as you are doing this excretion of hydrogen ions, you can combine these hydrogen ions here in the tubular fluid together with these bicarbonate ions and then you form back again carbonic acid, and then here your carbonic anhydrase enzyme can break down this carbonic acid into water that will be excreted in the urine, and then into carbon dioxide that can diffuse back into the cells, feeding back into this cycle, and at some point your urine will be basically more concentrated of hydrogen ions. So your kidneys will secrete and neutralize hydrogen ions. So much hydrogen ions can be concentrated that the pH of the urine can be up to 4.5. So basically your urine will be so acidic, and that will stop the secretion of more hydrogen ions, limiting the pH for secretion. Now, their tubular buffers will be what we call the phosphate system, that is nothing else but having phosphate groups that in this case will bind to hydrogen ions, and then you will acidify your urine more. Also, you have ammonium, which is going to do the opposite. It's going to neutralize the pH, so you will have combination of hydrogen ions with ammonia or ammonium ions that will act as an acceptor of hydrogens, and then you combine this with chloride ions, and then you form ammonium chloride, which will be a weak acid. And again, this happens within these tubular cells in the proximal convoluted tubule. And then in here, in this part, you can see how within the tubular fluid, you have excreted your hydrogen ions, and then you have these hydrogen ions now free to combine with these phosphate groups that will make this tubular fluid more acidic. And at some point, part of these hydrogen ions that comes here within this cell will combine with ammonium to form ammonium chloride that will be excreted in the urine. So the purpose of all these systems is basically to maintain our pH between 7.35 and 7.45, because in either extremes of pH, either in acidosis and alkalosis, you can have death. Okay, let me see. How many slides more do we have? I think we will stop here, but before we stop, I'm going to give you then the key points for this lecture. So in this lecture, we saw that cations are positively charged ions, and sodium is the most concentrated cation in the extracellular fluid. Also, we saw that the main function of the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system is to limit the pH changes caused by organic and fixed acids. Organic acids will be acids generated by the metabolism, like lactic acid, pyruvic acid, ketone bodies, ketone bodies that are generated by fat metabolism. All those are called organic acids. And these organic acids, together with fixed acids like phosphoric acids, etc., guys, are maintained in equilibrium by the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. Now, we also saw that a substance that limits changes in the pH is known as a buffer. And I didn't mention this to you, but now I'm going to mention it, that one of the causes of alkalosis is what we call respiratory alkalosis. And this respiratory alkalosis is caused by hyperventilation. For instance, when someone has a mental illness or fever. When someone has a mental illness or fever, the person starts hyperventilating, and this hyperventilation is an etiology or a cause for respiratory alkalosis. So you're supposed to be making notes out of this part at least, okay? The key points. So another key point is that the pH range is between 7.35 and 7.45, and alkalosis happens when actually the pH is above 7.45, as you can see here, and then acidosis happens when the pH drops from 7.35. Now, during acidosis, when the pH drops below 7.35, the kidneys will compensate by excreting more hydrogen ions and excreting less bicarbonate ions. So retention of bicarbonate ions is important in acidosis, along with excretion of more hydrogen ions, because you have excess of hydrogen ions. Now, the ions in general that are more concentrated in the extracellular fluid are sodium, chloride, and bicarbonate. And with this, this concludes the presentation of the lecture. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me through Canvas or email me. So this is all for this chapter, and I will keep you posted with the other lectures. Have a good night, or have a good rest of the day. Bye bye.